Let's see if we're live here. So this is the first for Cloud Conversations, our first live show. We're joined by authors of Microsoft 365 Security for IT Pros, now in its second edition, just out, hot off the press this week. I'm looking at the live chat and seeing if anyone can confirm that they can hear us and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully we have more success than Michael's last podcast was Practical 365. We'll see how we get on. So yeah, I guess, while we wait on questions and things to come through, do you guys want to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the book?
Yes, please take it away.
All right, thank you. So I'm Thijs Lecomte, happy to be here the second time on the podcast. So I'm from Belgium, currently a Microsoft 365 consultant working for The Collective, where Michael is my big boss. Besides work, I'm also an Intune MVP, but besides Intune, I also have a heavy focus on endpoint management and security and automation. So that's some of the topics we talked about last time. And my role on the book is twofold. During the second edition, I was always the technical editor, so keeping everybody in check, reading over all the chapters and checking all the technical things in the book, which is a lot, of course. And now I also wrote my own chapter, which is the Azure Sentinel chapter. I love Azure Sentinel, so it's great to write about it. And then Michael takes the role of technical editor for that chapter on him.
Nice. So I guess when you guys are approaching the book, the 365 is massive. The security element is massive enough. How do you decide what goes in and what goes out? And obviously you've got new stuff in this edition that wasn't in the previous one, but are there any hard decisions to make insofar as we're just going to have to leave that till next edition, edition 3?
I think there's always stuff. So even now, when we just finished the book and said, okay, we're going to publish this version the day after new things come out. So it's also always really difficult to keep everything up to date and also decide on what we're going to keep into the book. I think we're also looking for features which are applicable to most organizations, to most users, because you have very nice features which might not be applicable to everybody, and then that doesn't make sense. So I think that's a fine balance, but maybe Michael can collaborate on that one.
No, I think you're right. I mean, one thing we've given up on is trying to cover everything. When we first started out, so when I had the idea of, hey, I want to do this book, I gathered a couple of people to start writing it, and I said, let's cover everything we can. And then very quickly we realized, when we try and do that, we'll never get the book out of the door. Secondly, it changes so often. You kind of have to condense the most important things. It doesn't mean that we've covered everything that's really important. It just means that we've covered so much already. And probably in the next edition or throughout the updates that we're going to do in the coming months, we're going to add so much more. The thing is that what I'd like to avoid is become that 1,500-page book over time. Because whenever you pick up a 1,500-page book, you're like discouraged of reading it anyway. You're like, this is just too much, right? It's too much clutter. So we're going to try and rationalize stuff a little bit over time, move things out as they become less, relevant or better known, I would say, right? Where they're still relevant, but everyone's worked with it for a couple of years, and maybe it doesn't belong in the book anymore. Make it a add-on, whatever, to publish it as a blog post, and then just keep whatever is in the book, the newest stuff, the most relevant stuff at that point in time.
Fantastic. Right. So when did the first edition of the book come out? Remind me, please, and why did you decide that now was the right time for the second edition?
It's a little bit of the model, right? So the first edition we released July 13th last year of 2020. And we've set out with, this is a 1-year subscription, you're going to get 12 updates. But because we released in the middle of the month and we were going to do updates at the beginning of the month, we had a two-week period right after releasing the book, which wasn't enough to get it out. So we kind of slipped one update. So we said, we're going to give everyone 1 month extra just because we couldn't figure it out at the beginning. This is a learning process for us as well. So this is why we released at the middle of the month of August, and now we're going to publish every update in the middle of the month for another year. So coming August 2022, we're going to release a 2023 edition. or hopefully release a 2023 edition, and then keep that going, for as long as we're willing to write, and for as long as I find people willing to write with me, because that's, the one thing that I'm super grateful for is the people that are writing with the book today. They have to dedicate quite a bit of time, right? Every month there's updates to produce, things to write about, to follow up on, and life happens, right? People have jobs and personal lives, and they have to kind of juggle those priorities. So it isn't easy, right? Doing a book like this with just 4 people. So as we grow, as we onboard more topics, I think we'll probably onboard more authors as well, just to make it manageable. Because right now, I've got 4 or 5 chapters in the book. I'm not able to do a 6th or a 7th chapter. It's just not doable, right? So you kind of have divide and conquer there.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And who are the other contributors that you have involved, apart from Thijs and yourself?
So we've got Peter Dalmans, an MVP from the Netherlands, and focuses on Azure AD, so protecting identities. He did the Defender for Identity chapter and the Endpoint Management chapter. That's because Endpoint Management is his forte. He's also an Enterprise Mobility MVP, like Tess, and or Intune MVP, like Tess mentioned. And we've got Damien Scholes, who I've known for a long time. He's an Exchange MVP. We kind of were, for a long time, Exchange MVPs together. But he's since ventured into, like everyone else, Office 365 at large. Very much interested in security for Office 365. So that's why he did the Securing Mail, which still is really important. The Office 365 bits and pieces, and also the information protection chapter that we completely rewrote. And that's a beast, by the way. It's 110 pages right now, and I don't think we've covered about 50% of what's in MIP today. It's just, could be a book on its own, right?
Yeah, that was going to be something I was going to pick up with you guys, because I'm currently scanning through the chapter list of the book, and the MIP chapter, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the last edition, that wasn't its own dedicated chapter, was it? It was built into more just general Office 365 data protection. But I'm just looking through the contents now, and it's one of those things. I thought I knew Microsoft Information Protection, but it is massive when I look at this list of stuff here, right? Exact data match. And one of the things I struggle with MIP is the rate of change for that is quite intense as well. Insofar as just over the last few months, you've seen introductions to SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, being able to handle encrypted content. I guess, just as a general question then, when it's so big and so complicated, how do you distill it down to something that's easy to read in a book and not just too technically overwhelming?
When I find out, and I'll let you know, it's just, you start writing about things that that are used most, right? Where people have lots of questions about that, is the core of what you're doing. Like, we were debating whether or not we should include something about service encryption and customer key in that book. It's not massively used. There's just a couple of customers that I know that use it, but at the same time, it's a rather important feature. It's something that you have to know about, especially if you're in security, because it's one of these things where it can be a quick win. So what we decided to do is, instead of doing some detailed overview of this is how you do stuff, we just mentioned, hey, here it is. This is what it's about. This is why it's important. Kind of condense it into the really heavy stuff for you. And then if you want to figure out how to deploy it, there's probably blogs out there. There's a link to the Microsoft pages, and I think that's the most sensible thing to do. But it just is too massive. There's so many things that we didn't cover, and to be fair, what we're trying to avoid. So what we did last year is we borrowed a chapter from Tony Redmond's book, Office 365 for IT Pros, which is the reference, the Bible for Office 365, and they have the MIP chapter targeted towards Office 365 in there. So everything you mentioned about how do I do that in SharePoint Online and then OneDrive and Teams and so forth is covered in great detail there. I don't want to duplicate that effort. Written brilliantly. What I want to do is take all the other bits and pieces, or take the same components and just explain them at a generic level, like sensitivity labeling, great. You know how it works in SharePoint, but how can you leverage it outside of SharePoint? What's the value in the other workloads that weren't covered specifically in the Office 365 for IT Pros book?
Yeah, because I guess that's one of the big selling features of information protection sensitivity labels is they can hop anywhere, right? Because that protection travels with the file, it can go anywhere. And even more recently, they've expanded the scope of what a sensitivity label is. So it's no longer just encryption and content marking. It's also rules around a container, right? Or it's applying to Azure Purview and stuff like that. And I guess coming from a point of ignorance here with regards to Purview, how do you see that extension then where sensitivity labels are now also reaching into, I guess, not only Azure infrastructure, but my understanding of Purview is it also lets you protect things that are maybe in AWS and all that kind of stuff?
So, again, it was on my mind. I had a very brief, 2-second talk with Damien, we should probably look into this. But at the same time, should we, right? We're talking Microsoft information protection, and the book is called M365 Security for IT Pros. We've kind of ventured off M365 with Azure Sentinel, but if you want to onboard, Azure Purview, then what's stopping us from onboarding the Azure Security Center, Azure Defender, and
good point.
not quite sure whether or not I want to include that in the book or create a sibling book called Azure Security for IT Professionals, if you will, and kind of try and. It's hard. I mean, everything belongs together anyway. So, if anyone has an idea, anyone in the audience that thinks do this or that, just let us know.
Yeah, keep you busy. The book's not big enough.
Absolutely. You mentioned the title of the book there, security being prominent in the title, and Microsoft Information Protection very, very clearly belongs in the compliance stack, really, doesn't it? So how much more compliance is there in the book? Is information the only area that you touch on, or is there other things in there like DLP and e-discovery, communication compliance, that sort of thing?
So we didn't do the e-discovery part, but we did do the DLP bits and pieces. Like you heard Ru mentioned EDM, sensitive information types. So we covered that from a, again, holistic point of view, not the targeted to Office 365 kind of thing, because that's the Office 365 for IT Pros book. And again, we could have an M365 compliance book, right, as I mentioned earlier. It's just kind of try and include as much as we can that makes sense, because these are the things that people, once they've done their security, it's the first things that they're going to look at. I think I mentioned it in the book and in some of the chapters. I really say, you can have security without compliance, but you can't have compliance without security. So they kind of fit together, and I mean, we're just learning as we go. Sometimes there is no particular reason on why we included something. We just figured out, makes sense. Or it's because Stas adds these comments into the book, like you should include this and do this and do that.
Scope creep.
And I think, but it's also exactly the same for the different chapters, because we have a chapter per product, which is nice to get an overview, but you have the integrations within the Microsoft stack, which makes the product so powerful, and we want to focus on those integrations. But sometimes it's also extremely difficult to know when and where to set those integrations and how we combine them. So that's why also we have a new chapter, which is chapter 12, which is security and practice. So really getting hands-on with the security products and using, for example, Microsoft Intune compliance within conditional access. These kind of connections between the products is something we also try to implement within the last chapter to really provide that guidance for customers and for people who want to implement it.
That was one thing I was going to pick up with you guys when we're talking about the new content in this edition. It's that chapter 12 where it's real world scenarios, right? And you kind of touched on it there, where I think there's kind of an understanding within, when folks look at the Microsoft 365 security products, is every individual pillar of the security tools the best of breed? Maybe not. but where you get the real value is the integration and how easy that integration is, right? So I guess when you're talking about those real world scenarios, what are the kinds of things that you're including in there to help translate the theory behind it that's in the book to then say, well, folks who've bought the book can then go away and start doing stuff about it?
I think it's combined from our experience, like we are all consultants implementing the product. So what we see from day to day, also just because like I in the Azure Sentinel chapter was writing a lot of technical things, and I noticed, okay, I should probably implement some practical guidance. So while writing the book, I also think of a lot of notes, but also just readers who have questions, who have points. So today I had a question about my email is getting from my CRM is getting into spam, but that's combining DMARC, DKIM, the entire mail hygiene stack. It's so big that it could be a chapter there too. So it's a combination from everything: what we see, what we hear, what we know.
And that is a big challenge, isn't it? Because security and compliance, it touches all of those areas, those pillars within Microsoft 365, doesn't it? Goes all across messaging, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, everything.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to be careful. Again, scope creep. You can start with a very small something and end up with touching everything, basically. So as Des said, it's kind of trying to relocate some of the content that we had. Like there are some samples still in chapter 2 where I couldn't figure out whether or not to move them to chapter 12 because they explain, conditional access at some point, but at the same point, they already referred to some things in Intune, which is only covered in chapter 4. So people were reading about stuff that they would only learn in chapter 4. So should I move it to chapter 12, but leave away the sample in chapter 2? So it's difficult, and at the same time, it's easy because we've got a pile of questions from readers that send feedback and be like, hey, could you be more specific on this or that? So I've got a list of to-dos, basically, like scenarios I need to include in the next updates. Just because of the sheer amount of work that went into the book right now. Chapter 12 is light, I think, 25 pages. But with everything that we've got planned for the coming months, I'm afraid that it'll quickly grow to 100 pages as well, just because of scenario X, example Y, and so forth and so on. So,
when you're in the process of writing the book, you must learn a lot while you're writing it, because there's got to be stuff that you maybe not come across before or you've forgotten. What are some of the interesting things that you either learned or rediscovered when you were writing it that are maybe kind of hidden gems within the Microsoft 365 security capabilities?
That's a good question. So I'll take the first shot at this.
Sure.
While rewriting the Defender for Endpoint chapter, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to write about and leave some of the less relevant stuff out. But then at some point I started writing about network assessments and the device discovery capabilities. And as I was going through some of the tenants where we've deployed this, I just realized, like, geez, this is like super useful. Even though that we didn't dedicate like 70 pages on just that piece, this is just something that has the potential of becoming so important to the product because it gives you visibility about the things that you don't know. And to me, that was like the release of that feature was like side note, like, oh, by the way, we now do this. But actually, it's like super valuable. Like some of the tenants that I saw, I'm like, did you know that you have these devices running within your network? Like, do you know? And often they're like, we had no idea. I'm like, yeah, well, look at that. So that's a major one to me, at least. That's one I really liked and kind of fell in love with while writing the chapter.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, because I guess it also, you talk about folks being able to consolidate all their third-party vendors into the MS stack. That's another example where they're already paying for separate, inventory scanning tools. And I guess if you're paying for M365 Defender, why not use that?
We had a meeting with a customer, Michael and I, earlier this week, who had a pen test and was looking into all his Cisco devices, which are out of date. And then it was like, oh, it's there. You have the license already. We just have to deploy one scanner and you're ready to go.
Yep.
He was searching for third-party products, so it's indeed it's huge value. I also love about the book and finding features which might be not known to you is how other people write about it. So Michael and I work together day in, day out. Even we discover new things between us two. But like working with Peter and with Damien, it's interesting because they have a different type of customer, a different kind of looking at things, which really makes you think about, okay, I implemented products like this, but it could be also used in another way. So these are really nice insights we try to put into the book, as there's no one good way to use a product. You can do different methods and they're all perfectly valid.
Yeah, you do find that when you, as your kind of network of people starts to get wider and further, you see how they've kind of found, I don't want to say hacky ways around things, but you start to realize the product isn't always going to be used as the product manager's intended, right? And there's ways of achieving things that are maybe not supported, but they work, right? And there's 100 ways to skin a cat. One kind of follow-up question when you're talking about Defender for Endpoint, I put out I was trying to do a matrix recently where I wanted to find out what feels like 5,000 different features across all of Defender for Endpoint and say which platform they were supported on. And one of the problems that I stumbled across was there's a lot of, how do I say this nicely? How do I say this without getting in trouble? There's a lot of fluffy marketing words around a lot of the Defender products. And they're not always bad, but when you hear something like next generation protection, it's like, okay, but what does that mean? You know what I mean? That doesn't really tell me a great deal. So how did you find that process? Because you're obviously writing a very technical book. How did you find the process of maybe taking away some of the fluff that's out there in the documentation and translating that into the stuff that really matters?
So unlike you, I'm a little bit less politically correct, and I literally mentioned in the book in chapter 7, I believe, so the Defender for Endpoint chapter, I literally said, marketing at Microsoft is just confusing AF. It's like it just doesn't make any sense. Stop calling everything Defender, or mixing it up. Like here it's Microsoft Defender, there it's Windows Defender, and then you've got Defender EDR, you've got the AV, and then people talk about Defender for Endpoint, and are we talking about the EDR capabilities, or are we talking about the antivirus, or are we talking about both? And do they belong to the same feature set? Like attack surface reduction rules. One of the comments Tess made on my chapter is, well, technically it's not a Defender for Endpoint feature. I'm like, no, it's mentioned in the book that you don't need the licenses for it, but it belongs under the nomenclature of Defender for Endpoint because it's a attack surface reducing feature, which kind of is what the entire Defender suite is for. And one thing that we didn't want to do is make it even more complex, like taking out ASR and putting it in a different chapter that is not under the same nomen as Microsoft does, just makes things more confusing. So I also use the term next-gen protection because it gives people a reference to the real product, because that's how Microsoft calls it. Do I agree with that name? I mean, Palo Alto calls their firewalls the next-gen firewalls anyway. So, everything's next-gen, and the next-gen will be next-gens. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like that word modern, right? What's the next thing after the modern desktop? I've heard it'll just be called the more modern desktop. It's where does it end? But, I'm glad that, ultra modern. I couldn't help but just nod in agreement with everything you said there. The ASR rules is a great example. When you go on the Microsoft documentation page, the ASR rules are on the same branch, I guess you would say, as Defender for Endpoint. But then it gets quite messy because, is Application Guard part of Defender for Endpoint because it's called Windows Defender Application Guard? Is it part of Microsoft Defender? The marketing's messy, right? At the end of the day, it's just a whole bunch of products and services and it's got a label slapped on it. That's the way I kind of try and talk to folk about it. Don't overthink it, I guess, is the main thing.
Exactly that, right? It's just, just accept the fact that marketing is marketing, and they're going to do things that you're like, why? Like the rebranding of Defender ATP into the Defender suite. And I mean, sure, they have to have their thing and do their thing. And, at the end of the day, if that works for Microsoft, that's fine. But it's not just that, right? Defender does add some like the Defender license gives you the reporting capabilities, which you otherwise wouldn't have on ESR. So there is added value on why you have the Defender for Endpoint and why they kind of stuck it under there. But it's not just that, right? Even within one product, that like network protection, like trying to figure out how to make it easier for people to understand that the web protection capabilities in third-party browsers actually leverage the network protection feature, which is a different feature, but it kind of isn't. It's the same, because if you don't have this, you don't get that. Yep. And that's not super clearly spelled out because it's different categories. Like, how on earth do you start without confusing people? Hell, I'm even confused when I'm trying to explain it to anyone.
Yeah. The web protection and the network protection, and then smart screen and all these, how these things start overlapping with each other, it gets quite confusing, and I usually just kind of quickly run along from those conversations and try and ignore them. But one of the things that's talking about just more confusion about Defender, one of the things that's also relatively new to the space is this thing called Microsoft Tunnel, right? And my understanding is that's kind of been included within the Defender branding. At least it's within the same app now. Do you guys cover Tunnel in the book at all?
Yeah, we do. So it's one of Peter's chapters, actually, because indeed it began as just the standalone application. But of course, Tunnel as a VPN appliance. In order to enable Microsoft Defender mobile app, you need a VPN tunnel. So you had to have two VPN tunnels running at the same time, which is possible on a mobile device. So the consolidation makes sense. But like you said, it can be confusing for other people because everything moves so fast and it all gets thrown around. So it's difficult to keep an eye out and see what to search for.
Plus, on the Tunnel side of things, like Android, not iOS, so it's not just keeping track of the fact that things are changing, but the fact that they're changing somewhere first and then somewhere else. And that's the train, right? It's a fast-moving train, and you just have to go along with it and just accept the fact that some things are the way they are. And on the Tunnel side of things, to be honest, it's a discussion we had with Peter because he added it into the chapter. My first response was, who uses Tunnel? Like, honestly, who uses Microsoft Tunnel? I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, I love functionality, but honestly, like deploying a Linux VM in order to build that VPN tunnel for you versus I've already got a next-gen firewall or an F5 proxy that has micro-tunneling, which, by the way, is integrated in the profiles in Intune that you can push your VPN profiles on the device. So do you include it or do you not include it in the book? That too is where I'm a little bit of divided on still today.
Yeah, it's an interesting product, isn't it? Because it's when I first heard about it, honestly, I was quite surprised, because I'm kind of thinking, well, Microsoft are trying to force folks to move things away from having any dependency on-prem. We've got tools such as Azure AD Application Proxy to make it so that even if it is on-prem, we can get it without having to use any kind of VPN. So yeah, it's an interesting product, and it just surprised me when Microsoft released it. And I would be interested to hear the answer to that, who uses it, because again, it's not something, I'm sure there's folk out there using it and will have a use case for it. I just haven't met them yet.
I think, honestly, not sure how you guys, because that's an interesting question for you guys, right? But I do believe it's a big important thing in a compete scenario versus Mobile Iron. They've got the Sentry or whatever they call it these days that builds that tunnel to non-prem and bridges cloud native resources with legacy resources, which, let's face it, lots of organizations still have. How do you encounter that? Like, your customers, do some of them have Mobile Iron running? Do they have VPNs like that running from mobile devices into their environment, or?
It's not a scenario that I've experienced with any of my customers. I mean, we've had the problem where they will have on-premises apps, but none that were limited to mobile phones, right? So it would be a wider project as far as, because it's usually desktop apps. Quite frankly, because if you're thinking about legacy, it makes sense that that would be a desktop app, right? Because phones are relatively new, and as mobile apps have been developed, they've been developed with the cloud in mind, right? Using stuff like AWS or Azure. So yeah, I guess, you know, I would be interested to find out. I'll maybe do a little bit of digging about internally and then on social media and see if we can find out some useful use cases for that. But like you said,
I think it's mostly, I'm sorry.
No, on you go. I was just thinking, you know, if it's in a competitor's platform and a big customer has said, this is a bit of a differentiator for us, then it makes sense for Microsoft to throw it in.
Yeah, exactly. And just people migrating off legacy. We still have customers who would like to integrate Microsoft Intune into their file shares. So to have access to a file share, the first response we have to that is use SharePoint, use OneDrive, use Teams. But then they say, well, we can't for the next 2 years, but we still want Intune. And that's the things you run into. So the legacy will be moving forward, but as a couple of years. I think it's primarily done to keep the legacy, but also switch to modern and some of the parts like Intune, like mobile device management.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Makes sense, because, you know, no one's going to just flick a switch and all of a sudden we're doing cloud, right? And I do think that most organizations, you know, their heart is in, they understand the direction of travel, and they understand over the next few years we're going to be moving from on-prem file shares into things like OneDrive and SharePoint. But in the real world, when you've got, you know, 20 years worth of IT infrastructure behind you, it's easier said than done. So you've got to start somewhere, right? Thinking back to other chapters that are new to the book, one of those is, I believe you've got quite a lot more in regarding Defend for Identity, or Azure ATP as it was once called.
Yes.
One of the things I love about Defend for Identity is it's such a great tool to just, as soon as you're licensed for it, it's like, let's just get it out and see what we can find out, because it almost always finds something interesting, right? Not necessarily malicious, but something interesting going on.
Exactly.
What are your experiences with Defend for Identity, and how did you find writing that chapter?
So the chapter was written by Peter, who did an amazing job on it. I think Defender for Identity is one of those products which is often overlooked because it's only Active Directory, it's only on-prem. The Microsoft stack is only focusing on the clouds. They forget about it, but indeed, like you said, Drew, is just pushing that installer, that sensor to each domain controller, and you have that visibility. One of the reports, which is in the Defender for Identity portal, is unencrypted passwords sent over the network. It's hidden in the reports in the portal, but if you run it, almost for each customer, there will be something that authenticates through LDAP to Active Directory and will send an unauthenticated password on the network. So many customers don't know about it, but that's huge value that you see with these types of products.
Yeah.
And what I also love about the product is recently I have seen a lot of increase of activity from the product group on Twitter, and just chatting with folks, chatting about detections like the Petit Potam, which was released recently. It's actively being developed, new detections are being added, and some people thought it might be dead because you had 88 and you had ATP, but it's a different portal, it's an old portal, what's going to happen with it? But for me, the future looks really bright for it.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, because you're starting to see that convergence of all the portals into Microsoft 365 Defender, right? And it was one of those things where it kind of felt like it happened in a hurry. And obviously it's not the finished product, but it's what we have so far is nice. And it's better to have what we've got now rather than wait a year or two until it's all ready, right? And that's true of all kind of Microsoft Cloud products.
And the majority of customers out there are still leveraging some sort of on-premises infrastructure, aren't there? There's very few out there that don't have hybrid identity still, unless you're one of these fortunate born in the cloud businesses. So these are considerations that you need to have, because protecting your identity, which is effectively the new security perimeter in the cloud, is absolutely crucial. And you look at all the ongoing threats like Hafnium and ransomware and the stuff that it can pick up just in that initial sweep is quite astonishing, isn't it? When you think of it in those terms. So,
and also the cloud starts on-prem. That's often forgotten, that you're syncing identities. So when we do a security audit within the collective, one of the first things I ask is, can I have a look at your on-premises Active Directory? Can I see the AAD Connect server? And they say, but it's a cloud security audit. Well, it's just all being integrated, so you have to really be careful what you're getting from on-prem AD to Azure AD, because you can migrate all of the problems into it.
Yeah, syncing your domain admins and stuff like that. Yeah.
I mean, it's lateral movement doesn't just exist on-prem, right? You can move laterally from on-prem to the cloud, and off you go, right? And we've seen that in some of the supply chain attacks where they had some foothold on premises. We're able to get foothold in the cloud. We're able to do stuff in the cloud, and then all hell broke loose. And we're going to see more and more of that. But until we get rid of on-prem AD, which is going to take forever still, I'm super happy to have a product like Defender for Identity, because it just brings that so necessary insights and visibility into what's happening, because that's the attack surface number uno. Every penetration test report I've seen, third-party pen test report, is, oh, you've got Kerberosful accounts, oh, we were able to do this, you've got writable GPOs there, you've got this there, all on-prem. It's like, the cloud's fine, yeah, you've got a little something to worry about, but the major issues, they're all on-prem. So that's why these products really still matter and are so important. But to that point, as Taz mentioned, the on-prem identities, what I would love for Microsoft to solve once and for all is a couple of things, right? Is local admin password solution, cloud born, but doing something on-prem, so that I don't need to rely on the on-prem stuff anymore. And please extend that to, not just endpoints but servers as well. I think that's a really important thing that we're still missing, which is, at the end of the day, so important. And the fact that customers aren't treating their Azure AD Connect servers as tier 0. You mentioned like syncing domain admins. You know what? I can be forgiving, but just treating a domain controller and a Azure AD Connect server like any other server in the environment just gives me the shivers.
Or just people thinking, oh, but it's a server connected to Azure AD. The Azure AD module is installed there. I can run my scripts there.
Disable all PowerShell protections. You get that. No, it's I mean, I can't remember who said it. It was just a passing comment once, but someone in a workshop I was in once said that, securing on-prem AD is like, it's a rocket science, right? It's brain surgery. It's so complicated. And to your point, I guess one of the things that is lacking and is stopping people from being able to go to Azure AD Join it's that local admin password solution, right? Because you're having to go to something. There's stuff out there, right? There's community created projects and things like that, but that can be difficult to get through your internal governance, right, and your internal processes and all that kind of stuff. I do think it's on the roadmap. I'm sure I've seen things on Twitter where they're saying, yeah, it's coming, but it keeps getting pushed down and down the line.
And that's one of these things where sometimes the cloud is also taking a step back, which is so annoying. Like you're saying, okay, we always preach Azure AD Join is the way to go. The improvements, this, and that will go so much easier when you go AD Join. But then things like labs don't work. Or for example, for the longest time, Azure Virtual Desktop didn't have native AD Join support. So we had customers all of their endpoints, Azure AD Join. Virtual desktops, you still had to join to on-prem, which is so stupid. So let's hope indeed in the future that will be increased and the downside of the clouds will be decreased, so that we also see all of the benefits over there.
Yep, absolutely. I just see that.
I'm just looking at the chat.
Yeah, I said that it was Kevin Beaumont that said that. I should have known it would be Kevin that said that comment about securing AD. I guess, so thinking about how all these things fit together, then, and you mentioned earlier that with regards to the scope of the book, that Sentinel really isn't part of Microsoft 365, right? But you can't have that discussion about Microsoft 365 security without it, right? It's on the front of everyone's lips, and there's maybe a little bit of misunderstanding about where exactly it sits. People know it's they know it's a SIM, but how does it fit into everything else? And I guess question to you guys is, how do you take all that stuff that is in the book, you've explained it, and then say, okay, and here's why you also need Sentinel when you've already got stuff like 365 Defender?
So I think indeed a lot of customers are looking into Microsoft Defender like a SIM, but it correlates all the incidents at a single pane of glass, which is great compared to a couple of years ago, where you had the 4 or 5 different portals. So that's a huge benefit. But of course, then you're only focusing on the Microsoft stack and the Microsoft logs you have, but you always have a proxy log, you always have firewall logs, which are so important to correlate. So that's one of the big advantages for Sentinel, of course, is the aggregator of all logs. But something that's often overlooked, in my opinion, is the ability for playbooks to easily run within Azure Sentinel. I love playbooks, I love automation. And for example, it's so easy to sync all of your incidents from Azure Sentinel to your ITSM like Jira or ServiceNow. So easy through Azure Sentinel, but with Microsoft Defender, it's not that easy. So the additional cost and complexity with Azure Sentinel is so limited, in my opinion. It's so low, it's so easy to spin up, that for my opinion, it's no brainer to activate, even if it's only a incident aggregator for your Microsoft incidents.
That's a good point, because one of the things that does, I don't know if scares the right word, but it maybe makes folk a bit hesitant to jump into Sentinel, is that it's the price structure of it, right? And as far as it's consumption based, I guess, is that a valid concern, or is it something that you need to really be a giant corporation for it really to be of any concern?
So I think it's confusing for organizations, because they want to know, I have so many endpoints, so many users, I have these products, what is it going to cost me? But as your Sentinel cost is built per gigabyte ingestion and also for retention. So it's confusing to make that conversion. But if we're looking into just the Microsoft stack and just starting small with these Microsoft security products and integrating them, you pay so little for that ingestion, because all of the alerts, all of the incidents from Microsoft products is free. So that's already a no-brainer. Then you can ingest things like sign-in logs, audit logs, Office activity. I think Office activity is entirely free, if I'm not mistaken. Sign-in logs and audit logs are built, but it's also so small. So I recommend everybody to just start with that, start with the baseline, and then see where you go and start increasing slowly. But of course, you have organizations who see the data connected for Microsoft 365 Defender. They enable all of the advanced hunting tables and let all of the data sync from Defender to Sentinel. And then they have a bill of 5,000 euros a month. So it's something you have to be really careful with what you do, because like you said, it's really easy to boost that cost and make sure it just explodes. So that's something to be aware of.
Okay.
Okay. One of the buzz phrases that you see a lot of at the moment in the security world is zero trust. It's everywhere. You can't look around without seeing it. So how would you describe the principles of zero trust to those watching? And is it a topic that you cover within the book in the new edition?
Unfortunately, we do. The reason why I say unfortunately, it's a buzzword, right? Zero trust, and there's a couple of other ones that we just have to use. If not, we're not being taken seriously as a security book. But at the end of the day, it's the concept that it is new, has been around for a while. It's going to stick around for a while. It's the assume breach, zero trust. Don't trust anything, and if you try and trust anything, verify before you actually trust something, and do it at multiple layers. Today, going into a true zero trust approach for everything is just really hard. Technology isn't at the point where you can do full zero trust.
Yeah.
We're getting there, right? The efforts Microsoft's made in terms of integrating all their products and being able to leverage the device state and everything else brings you into a almost full zero trust approach. And for digital natives or these cloud-born organizations like we are, we don't have an on-prem footprint. We're entirely in the cloud. We have a full zero trust approach. We don't even have a corporate network. If you plug it into the network, you get an internet IP address. You're on the internet. Every endpoint is an island. We leverage M365 completely. But even there, you see that we have a couple of gaps. And I know, pointing out gaps isn't something that most vendors like. But one thing that today Microsoft doesn't do is, well, I don't mean network protection, but they don't have a forward authenticating proxy, like not a CASB, like Zscaler does, or Netscope does, or any of the proxy servers. And you might think, why do I need that? Because I've got a Defender running on my endpoint. But the thing is, it's running on your endpoint, so the threat's already made it to the endpoint. And from a true security multi-layered approach, I want to have something in front of that, right? And that's the only piece where I see that Microsoft today doesn't have a great answer. They've got a great product on the endpoint, but nothing in between. So, that zero trust approach, we do mention it in the book, like, hey, treat it for what it's worth. It can go a long way, but you're still going to have to look at other sort of things. And besides that, every environment is different. Like, I haven't seen anyone where it can be like, oh yeah, sure, you just do this and you'll be fine, except for MFA. Just do MFA and you'll be fine.
Yeah, the golden rule. Yeah, it's funny that's something I think you and me were talking about recently in the work, Peter. It was a Zscaler, and it was the fact that here's what it is. Microsoft, they don't really have an equivalent, you know what I mean, as far as being able to proxy all that traffic. They'll buy someone and call it Defender for something else.
No doubt.
Yeah, it's a good point on the zero trust thing, though, because it's one of those things that in theory, sounds great, but is the tech there yet? And you see interesting things, because one of the things I know you cover in the book is for conditional access is continuous access evaluation, right? And in my mind, when I hear that as a term, I think, wait a second, that's exactly what zero trust is about, right? It's taking as many signals as we can, as constantly as we can, evaluating it, and then making a decision about what we allow folks to do. Yet, then you find out kind of, at least to me, and someone can jump in and correct me if I'm misunderstanding the problem here, but then you also find interesting little nuances with regards to the way that, for example, Windows 10 handles strong authentication with Windows Hello for Business and stuff like that, where it will stamp saying MFA has been satisfied if someone, let me get this right, if someone Azure AD joins a device and they go through an MFA prompt, they're never going to get another MFA prompt. And to me, that kind of runs counter to zero trust, because it's not continually assessing the situation, is it? It's saying, a few months ago, you Azure AD joined and now we're fine. If I'm understanding that right, anyway.
Unless you do a compliance policy where you say, if you don't meet these and these requirements, for instance, your antivirus has to be up to date, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. You're being evaluated on those things, and you're constantly being evaluated. And this is the truest discussion that we have with basically every security team when we talk about Hello for Business is Hello for Business true multi-factor authentication, or isn't it?
Yeah.
If you look at the tech specs, it is, right? You have to have the device and a unique PIN code or whatever you're going to use to do the second factor. So by definition, it is multi-factor authentication. However, all I need is a PIN code, because if I can sneak into onto your device, then I just unlocked the keys to the castle and I can go pretty much anywhere. And this is where the multi-factor unlock in Windows comes in, where you can actually force multiple factors to actually unlock the device. And get into Windows, because that's where the challenge is. It's today that I'm going to call Windows 10 legacy, but the login window prompt for Windows, the only solution that I can think of the top of my head that does MFA while logging into Windows is that extension that Duo has for logging into Windows. Why hasn't it been built natively into that login screen by Microsoft already, right? Like, how hard could it have been to do that, right?
Yep, 100%. And it's something I know that our friend Rudy Ooms, he wrote a blog on this, and he pointed out, quite rightly, that, as much as Microsoft has this reputation of either eating up the competition, copying the competition, why haven't they copied this? It's so obvious, right? And there's so many customers that, like you said, when you have that discussion with them and you tell them that Windows Flow for Business is actually multi-factor authentication and that the TPM is a factor for authentication, they kind of laugh at you sometimes because it's portable, right? And it's very easy to take, right? It doesn't count in our minds as being real. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning you. Anytime, Rudy. Absolutely. Call you out.
So let's hope maybe that's where FIDO2 comes in, right? I know Jan Bakker, who was a previous guest, he's a big fan of FIDO2, but that might be a nice improvement if they also improve the integration between Windows 11 and FIDO2, which could come in great. But of course, the downside you have there is a lot of customers have to manage another thing for the user. No way. Let's not even think about it. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's true. The thought of handing out even more hardware to a user can be kind of difficult, but it is a good point insofar as there are hacky ways around forcing the MFA, using Azure MFA on Windows 10, but maybe it is because the larger goal is, true passwordless insofar as you give someone a temporary access password code, they get a FIDO key, and then that's it. You know what I mean? It's a messy situation, but who knows? Maybe in a few years' time, things will be a bit clearer as far as where do Microsoft really see this going.
It's a tough cookie to crack anyway, right? Just because there's so many other things you could do exactly as you just mentioned, but then you've got to hand out all these devices. It's an additional cost and additional management burden. So why not start using these devices, which we've been doing quite successfully for a while? But then you get into scenarios where people aren't getting a cell phone from their employer, and they're not willing to use their personal cell phones for this. And they're like, nope, if you're not giving me a phone, then I'm not using it for company purposes. So, I mean, there's all sorts of variations where technology doesn't even help, right? Where the problem is with the legislation, with people. Even today, right, I'm baffled sometimes by the responses of some people, like how they respond to, oh, if I needed to do this, I'm not going to do that. Like, yeah, but it's for security purposes. Yeah, but it's annoying, so I'm not going to do it. I don't get it. I'm like, you read the news, right? You know that your behavior is exactly what's causing these breaches, and they're like, yeah, no, it's just annoying. I'm not going to do it. And usually it's the higher ups, the C-levels that take that approach. It just gets to me every time.
It is. It's an interesting one. It's the kind of, for every 10 people you meet that are fully on board and fully understand and want to be secure, you kind of run into that person that's digging their heels in the ground and they're saying, okay, but I should be the exception because, and there's always a reason, right? And the goal that we need to have is to say, well, all your excuses are lies. They don't stand up to much scrutiny, do they?
This is so important, though, because and it reminds me of something I saw on LinkedIn earlier today, in fact, that was from a colleague of mine that shared from Sophos. And it was 3 things that breach victims wish they had done. Number 1, unsurprisingly, enforce MFA for system administration and security consoles. Number 2, block public-facing remote desktop protocol. And number 3, deploy endpoint security everywhere. So really is a case of don't wait until it's too late. Don't close the stable door after the horses have bolted.
The latter part is something that struck me really hard during the Hafnium attacks, right? We were called in with so many organizations, mainly because legacy and exchange, and then turned into a security. So if you're bring an Exchange vulnerabilities to life, everyone thinks of you. I've been in so many customer situations where I'm like, yeah, okay, so we can see that your server has been exploited, like the shell's running. I have no visibility. Like you haven't even turned on your security logging, like 20 megs. You kept the Windows default. Like on Earth, we're not 1980 anymore. You've got terabytes sitting empty on that server. Why do you keep your security logs at 20 or 100 megs? Why don't you turn on script block logging for PowerShell? Why on earth haven't you done those basic things? I'm not even talking about deploying the latest, greatest endpoint security stuff, like just getting some basic visibility. I don't get it. I really don't.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And with regards to the kind of, you mentioned the Exchange logging, 20 megs worth of Exchange log is going to last like, what, 20 seconds? You're just not going to have much data to go back to. And I guess, if folk are in that situation where, let's say I've inherited a poorly managed environment, right? And it's mostly on premises. What are the first things that folks should do? Let's say I've just got a new job. I'm starting as a sysadmin at a small to medium-sized business. They've got a whole baggage of on-prem stuff, and I want to go in and modernize it, get it more secure. Where would you guys recommend is the starting point for that journey?
Read the book.
Buy the book.
Good answer.
I was a little bit sneaky. No, I mean, there is a saying in Dutch that says meten is weten, which basically means if you measure, you know. If you don't measure, you don't know. So if I were to inherit an environment, I'd first go out into figuring out what am I dealing with? Like, what is running? How is it configured? Instead of just accepting that things are the way they are, I'm just gonna question everything. Like, we have this. Why? What are my threats? The first chapter in the book, and that's kind of why I said it, is not technical. It's just explaining people, how do you decide on what do you do, right? You create a map, a threat matrix, to understand what's my exposure, what's my attack surface, and then from there you take a look, what is the biggest one that I need to deal with, and then you go out and deal with that, and then you move on to the next and the next and the next. And I'm just surprised that many people that inherit an environment like this, they have no clue what they're running. They're like, oh yeah, it's been there for 10 years. I mean, never thought about asking around or poking around or just pulling the plug and see if anyone yells. Even if everything else fails, I would do that, like literally pull the plug and be like, oops, because someone will yell at you, and at least you know who you can yell back at to tell them you need to do something about this, right? And sure, we're jokingly mentioning how this goes because it's not about the people. It's just because they don't get the support. There's like this one IT guy that needs to run 100 servers and 150,000 endpoints. I mean, there's only so much you can do, right?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I love that example of just start unplugging stuff. And I think back to my kind of early days in IT, that was kind of the approach I took, insofar as let's just turn this off, let's break it, let's change it, and as long as we've got a rollback method that we can implement quite quickly, that's as good a test as anything, right? You know what I mean? Let's just turn on this security switch, and if nobody complains about it, let's leave it on. So yeah, that's a nice approach. Just break it, right, and then fix it if you need to.
That's how you learn, right? So one of these things I see often is attack surface reduction rules. You put them into audit mode, then a month later you'll audit them. You will have in Defender like 100,000 events, even more, and then you start digging through them, and you have to spend ages digging through them. Possibly almost all false positives, not sure what to do. So like in these cases, just pick the 10 most occurrent applications, exclude them, and then roll the rules out gradually just to see what happens, because you can audit as much as possible, but you will never know the true impact on the organization.
Yeah, and I would bet you that a lot of customers who go in with the best intentions and start in audit-only mode, how many of them follow up on that and then eventually go to block mode?
Exactly.
Probably not many.
Exactly.
I guess, yeah. It's ASR rules are a funny one because they can break so much, but at the same time they're quite powerful, because one of the cool things that you get with Defender 365 is you get hopefully I'm getting the name of it right, threat analytics, I think it's called, where it's the kind of, the story about what are the prevailing threats out there. And when you look at the threat analytics, it says, here's the things within our product suite that would have or will block that. And ASR rules, they invariably show up in there, right? They're always in there, specifically for stuff to do with ransomware and things like that.
Exactly.
And the thing there is, they break stuff. They shouldn't. Like, if an ASR rule breaks something, it means that you're dealing with shitty software. I'm sorry. It shouldn't be breaking anything. It's just, making sure that your attack surface reduces. And if there is an application that tells you, oh, I still need this, not vulnerability, but this thing wide open to function, then I would just question that application and be like, why on earth? But am I still doing this? And if I still need it, then move it into Azure Virtual Desktop, run it separated from, the environments, isolated, so it's not, hampering your endpoint. But again, there's ramifications to everything, and legacy is something that takes time to deal with, I guess.
Yeah. No, well, it is. It's one of the great benefits and one of the great weaknesses of Windows as a platform, right? It's that legacy support that you can run an app from 15, 20 years ago and you just know it's going to work, right? But it's Windows is just like, when I think about like what Windows 11 as it will be as an operating system is, it's just like this massive stack of loads of stuff just piled on top of each other, fixing things. And there's a lot of, what would you say? There's a lot of baggage there, right? And that also goes back to the point about why changing stuff like the credentials you can use for MFA and things, that breaks stuff, right? You know what I mean? Because it's having to deal with all this legacy code.
Take a look at the print nightmare. I know Kevin Beaumont on Twitter is very talks a lot about it, but it's so many legacy, and probably in Microsoft, does anybody really know 100% how the print spooler works? They have to take so many to the modern world, but it just collides. It doesn't work anymore.
No. Yep.
I mean, consider just the sheer size of something like Windows. I know that at some point at a conference, they were talking about Exchange Server running 25 years old at that time, and it had millions of lines of code. I think nearly 25 or 50 million lines of code, single product. Now go back to Windows and imagine how many millions of lines of code is that. It's just not something you maintain in a jiffy, right? It just is. There is legacy is going to be there for. Sometimes you just discover things when you discover them, right?
Yep, for sure. And that's an interesting one because I'm going to pick up on that. You mentioned per nightmare, Tej. So like one of the kind of things that I can't help but think about is Microsoft have put so much investment over the last 5-10 years into having that reputation of, oh no, we are secure now. We do think about it as part of our culture, to the extent where it's almost a meme now where they say Microsoft is a $1 billion security company or something like that. But I think it's fair to say that probably since the end of last year, but certainly over the last few months, it's just felt like every time I sit down in the morning and I open Twitter, it's like, oh God, what is it now? What's going wrong with Windows 10? What are we exploiting now? What RCE is it? And so I guess, how do Microsoft keep that reputation? Because as I'm looking at it, outside looking in, it doesn't look like they're doing that good a job, if I'm being honest.
Exactly. I think communication is key here. You see in so many vulnerabilities, and there's often not a lot of discussion about it or not clarity about it, which is a hassle because I think as a customer, we can understand it takes a while to patch and it takes a while to implement because the product is so vast. But we just have to know what is going on, why should we care, and how can we circumvent it in the now and until the patch is ready. Because right now, even throughout all of the blogs, not even Microsoft blogs, through all the community blogs, it's so difficult to know, what do I have to do? What is my exposure? Which is a hassle. So I do hope that communication will improve. in order to decrease that lifetime. But also after all these patches, so Print Nightmare 1 through 6, I think, if I'm not mistaken, then also Hive Nightmare, and then they bring out Windows 365 with legacy boots, no secure boots, no credential guards. That's such a bad timing. That's hard to see, and it breaks my heart as well to see how they do these kind of things.
Yay for marketing.
Yeah,
As
Microsoft
long
is
as they're
one,
telling a good story, that's
Yeah.
all that matters.
Microsoft is a $1 billion marketing company. That's what the line should be. I guess.
Never heard that before.
Yeah, it's a good
No, I
point though,
mean,
because the Windows 365 thing, when you seen that it didn't have a TPM, it was like the optics aren't good, right? Even if there's a valid reason, it's about optics, about
Exactly.
marketing. To your point,
and it will. We know Microsoft. It will come. We just have to wait a while. It's still preview. Product teams are probably just being pushed to get something out as fast as possible to show value. Some of the easiest thing to let go is the security side. But like you said, it's the optics, which is so painful.
I noticed that Michael was about to jump in with something, and then I started ranting about TPM. No, I was wrong. Cool.
So I also saw in chat. Sorry.
No,
Go ahead,
no, on you go. No, I was just going to complain about something else, but I've done enough complaining. Let's talk about something positive.
No, but I saw in chat Louis asking about more best practices and real-world examples, which
yes.
I think we could fill a book of 1,500 pages, just all best practices and real-world examples. So we are actively looking for the book for more of these kind of things to fill the chapter with a lot of value. So this is an open call. If you ever had feedback at m365securitybook.com, which will get to us, and we'll certainly take a look at that feedback and try to implement it as much as possible. Because the book, we love helping people. I think everybody in the community loves helping people. The book is there to help people. So if we can implement things inside of the book that will help you, do let us know.
And what's the reaction been to the book in its lifetime? What sort of feedback have you got in general?
I mean, it's been overwhelmingly positive. When you first start a venture like this, you're like, I don't know what's going to happen. Are people going to like this? Are they not going to like this? But the feedback that we've gotten is great. Sure, yep, we've had our fair share of, hey, you've misspelled this and misspelled that, which I appreciate because going through 800 pages, you're bound to miss stuff. And I'm the editor, like the language editor as well. I'm not even a native English speaker, so I appreciate if people point out, yeah, that was really bad English, Michael. So aside from that, lots of positive feedback, like, hey, we love that you do this, keep up doing that, or hey, can you look into XYZ? We've based a lot of our updates just on the feedback, where people said, I need more of this. We just take that, we write it, we make it and put it into an update. So getting that feedback, that interaction is just what keeps us going. Plus, that's what makes the book valuable, right? Let's just assume that I dedicate a chapter to the Microsoft tunnel, and everyone says, nope, but we're not interested. There's no value in that. When everyone says we need more info on this, like real world examples, like practical guidance. One of the things that's currently in chapter 12 that we've had 20 times, 30 times more even, that we heard is people, how on earth do we investigate an alert? Like, where do we start? What do we look at? So what we did in chapter 12 now is take one example. I mean, you can't add 250 different ones, and just tell them, okay, so when you're here, this is the first thing you do. This is what you do then. Then you take a look at that. Oh, look what you can find there. Then you pivot here, to kind of take people on a journey on our thought process when we're investigating alerts that trigger something in our SOC.
And everyone who's contributed to the book is obviously very, very experienced in their field technically and what they do. But writing's a whole other thing completely. Prior to this, did any of you have any prior authoring experience, and did you get any guidance on that, and how was that for you?
Sure. I wrote a couple of books before. I think I wrote my first book in 2012. Change 2013 cookbook back in the day. That was a horrible experience, first book ever. But again, you learn a lot from that process, and then co-authored several other books. And then with Tony Redmond and Paul Cunningham wrote the first 4 editions of the Office 365 for IT Pros book. And Tony was the editor, and there were times that I could really be like, Tony, stop, right? He's on top of things.
I find that hard to believe.
I appreciate all the more, and because I learned so much about writing in English, what's good and bad, and sometimes I look at stuff that I wrote and I can hear Tony in my head being like, "This is rubbish."
Always write in active voice. Active voice.
He messed me up for life. But at the same time, I do the same thing to the other authors. I think when they get their chapter back read of comments and things that I've edited, or where people be like, "This isn't my text anymore, Michael," I'm like, it's important, and you'll thank me for it later, or just hate me for it, whatever you please.
I think that's also one of the things that people really underestimate is how much time Michael spends on all the chapters to make sure, one, that they're written indeed in good English, written grammatically well, but also they make sense between the entire book, because you're writing one book with 4 different people. When I go over it with my technical editing before Michael goes through it with his editing, I see the differences between the chapters, and that's normal because you have different authors. But when Michael goes through it, it's one book, which is a really hard task to do and takes a lot of time, but it provides so much value that we try to give to the reader as well, to make sure it's all one single piece.
It's a good point, and I do think that most folks would not necessarily appreciate that, because you need to stop it from feeling like 4 books, right? Because you get 4 authors. And is that is that a challenge then, insofar as keeping a consistent style, making sure that there isn't duplication of effort and things like that?
Sure is. I mean, you want to keep the authenticity of each author, right? You don't want to make it one voice. The value of the book is it's 4 voices for different aspects, for different thoughts. And what I try and do is sometimes I'll write a little piece of my own in someone else's chapter. Like, I'm thinking of something that I think is really kind of fits in here, so I'm invading their privacy of their chapter, if you will. But it's more about the flow. It's not how they write. Sure, sometimes I'll edit something because in my head it sounds better or different. I would say not better isn't the case, but just like to keep it consistent. It's more making sure that chapter 1 kind of agrees with chapter 2 to chapter 3. There's an intro, there's an outro, that people understand why we're doing the things that we're doing it, and then also listening to that feedback. So there goes in a lot of work, especially if it's a new chapter. It's like it takes me 4 or 5 days to go through a new chapter, and mainly because doing it after hours as well. Not being native English speaker, so if you get a text and it just kind of messes with you. But at the end of the day, I think it's better, and it's very much needed, and we're still keeping the author's voice, because if not, then it would be the Taz book or the Michael book or the Peter book, and that's not the goal. It's a collaboration between the authors, and that's how we want to put it out there.
And I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well, Peter, because you did the Teams book also with another co-author, right?
I did, yes. I co-authored that with Nate Chamberlain, very good friend of mine, fellow MVP based in the States, and it was a great experience. I actually, I've participated in 2 books now. The first one I wrote on my own, the MS 500 Security Administration Exam Guide, and then the Teams one with Nate. And I much preferred writing it with a co-author for 2 reasons, because A, you've got somebody to bounce ideas off and sanity check things before it goes for tech editing, and secondly, it gives you a chance to get your own 2 different sort of styles in there, whilst sticking to the overall narrative. I mean, writing a book for a publisher, as we did, we have very clear guidelines for writing an outline, so you've got to stick to a script in a sense. But what was really pleasing when I saw the final product was it was cohesive as a book. The message was there. Each chapter was, this is what you learn in this chapter, then into the subsections, and then at the end, this is what you've learned. Here's some takeaways. Here's some practice questions. But so it was all the same in that regard, but we could see there was our own personalities in there as well, in little things, in how we did screenshots and diagrams and things like that. But wonderful experience. But the tech editing from the publishers can be very brutal, right down to the part where the admin centers in 365, of which there are many, as we all know. The exact case matching can be different all over the place. So I was called out many times by the editor saying, is this the correct case as in the admin center? Well, it might be here, but it might not be there. And when we started writing the book, they've renamed it. So these are the challenges that you have as well. When you start writing it, it's called one thing. And when you finish, you've got to go through, and before you release it, it's totally different. But the books that I participated in are kind of, annoyingly, they're kind of dead on arrival in many respects, in that as soon as it's like when you drive a car off the forecourt, you're losing the value immediately because it's almost immediately out of date. This is the great thing about your book and Tony's book, the Office 365 for IT Pros, is that the way it's updated, it's a challenge I can't imagine. But it's so good to be able to do that, and I actually question whether I would write more books in the way that I've done it because of that, because I find that frustrating.
Yeah, and I mean, two things there is that in our current book, I'm sure that there are style mismatches between chapters. Like sometimes I noticed that I used font X here and font X there, but going over the book and spending countless hours trying to figure out and make that consistent, I don't think the value lies in there. I think people can be forgiving of not always using the same fonts here and there. But exactly that point, the self-publishing that we're doing right now is super critical, because I haven't found or haven't seen any publisher out there that is able to do the same thing, because they have these rigorous processes that you have to go through. Yep. And it doesn't mean that books can be valuable. Don't get me wrong. If you're talking about concepts and stuff that is valid for a longer period of time, absolutely. But with anything that's cloud, like if you push out a typical book, even a printed book on Office 365, by the time it hits the shelf, you're like, well, that used to be the case, but it's different now. It looks different, feels different, does different things. I don't think that makes a lot of sense anymore, but maybe it's just me.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's challenging. I remember you, Peter, saying you kind of, the first edition of your security MS500 exam came out, right? And then within weeks, the criteria changed, right? You know what I mean? And now it's Sentinel. Yeah. You had to go and do a second edition.
I had to add in a chapter about Sentinel, and boy, how I wish I'd known you at the time, Thijs, because I would have been talking to you. Because I'm going to hold my hands up. I knew nothing about Sentinel, and the publisher, was saying we need to add this in. We need to add this. Okay, so I just got my head into it and played with it, and it really is the absolute basics of Sentinel. Because you could have an entire book on Sentinel. Obviously, I think there is one somewhere from memory. Yeah. So it really was just the basics that might crop up in the exam, luckily for me. And that's the only update I've ever had to do for that book, though. And the outline changes every now and then, but I've been fortunate with that particular book that it's not changed that much that it's warranted an overall update yet. So we've talked about it. We've talked about a second edition, a full second edition, but the last outline change was very, very minimal, very cosmetic, no real major changes in technology. So it's not quite time for it yet. The Teams one, I have a feeling that the publishers will be coming to Nate and myself in due course to update that one, because I think a lot has recently changed in that outline, not least of which is all the Skype for Business Online stuff is now expired. So that's no longer relevant. So No, that'll be interesting because I'm really not in the right mindset to write at the moment. You have to be in a very specific place, don't you? You have to be on it and commit to deadlines and timescales. Because the first book I had a schedule. It took me and it took 9 months to write that book because it was a big old book. It's about 580 pages, just under 600 pages, and I did maybe on average after a month, and then it would go through the process of editorial, sort of proofreading, editing, and then technical editing, and back and forth, and then read further drafts. So, and that was one of the other benefits of co-writing with Nate, is that we half the time of getting the book out there, which in any Microsoft 365 subject is absolutely crucial. You can't hang around waiting to get that book out there. So, always find at least one co-author would be my advice.
And this was also my first time writing, actually. I wrote blogs before, but never a real book. And I was really taken by the amount of work that comes into it. One, it just takes a long time. I think the Sentinel chapter is only 90 pages, something like that. But that takes a lot of work just to write it out. But then you also have to just make sure that everything is correct. And then you face documentation, Microsoft, which isn't correct. You have to check things with the product team. You have to check things with colleagues. So it takes a lot of work. And while you can know a product, you don't always know the entirety of it. Like you said, Peter, sometimes things creep in and you have to implement it, but it takes some time to also get to use the features you're not always using. You have to get to know them and get to know them really good in order to implement it in the book.
Yeah,
completely. And even when you do sort of your day-to-day job and you're doing workshops with customers, I've been in a position where I've done a particular workshop any number of times, and then this one time I'll be demoing it with a demo tenant, and something's changed and it catches me off guard, and I'm like, oh, that wasn't there this time last week. But you just got to react to that. You've constantly got to be on your toes and keep your knowledge fresh and adapt and be ready to adapt at short notice.
And I mean, all of us can probably feel the other side of the pain as well, is that we've got a, private preview tenants, public preview tenants, public tenants. And then sometimes you're like, which one am I in? And is this already public? Or, I mean,
oh yeah,
it's like, is this a public preview? Oh, but the public preview is in that tenant, not in that tenant. Is that because there's something wrong? I mean, it's just sometimes it's a mess.
Yep.
It can be very difficult, especially as MVPs as well, when we get access to certain things that are coming, and it becomes very difficult knowing what you can and can't share sometimes.
And even like within our company, the collective, so we have an NDA with Microsoft. So we have information from Microsoft that we can share between each other. But then I'm also an MVP, so I have MVP information which I can share with sometimes with fellow MVPs like Michael. But then you have other information which is really specific to you as an MVP, and you cannot share with somebody else, with another MVP. So it's dangerous.
It really is. It really is.
You can share all here if you want. That won't be a problem.
No.
Nope, not going to do that. Nope.
No good shit. Yeah, it's just kind of thinking. One of the things you mentioned there was the name changing and how I guess that happened for Peter when you wrote the physical book. That's hard to go away and update. And obviously you guys are dealing with it monthly, which is a good way to keep it off name changes, right? Because it's only ever going to be 1 month out of date. I remember seeing on Twitter recently, I think it was Greg Shields who does Pluralsight courses. And he literally the week before Azure Virtual Desktop, he'd just finished like 9 hours worth of course for Windows Virtual Desktop. And it was like, I'm not going to redo that. But it's, I guess video is another problem, right? Because you can't just find all and replace.
Bleep it out.
So,
like a swear word.
You've got these deepfakes that you can make, so maybe they can do something with that and just replace the Windows with Azure, and off you go.
There you go.
Yeah,
we have the
physical book is a frustrating one, though. Definitely, Rue. I agree with that. But on the flip side of that, one thing, it was always one of my ambitions in life to have my own book, and as much as I would probably never read a physical book myself, when it came to my own with my name on it, I wanted that so badly. So
the conversation I had with Michael this week as well. Just to have the book in your hands, right? It's a nice feeling. It's an amazing feeling.
It is definitely.
I would bet it's expensive to print a book the size of Security for IT Pros. I mean, how many pages is? I know the new edition is close to 100 pages more, I think, than the last one, if I'm not mistaken.
It's about
787.
Yeah.
That's a heavy book. 787 pages.
Actually, this is a good question. I mean, I think it really depends on the finish. Like, if you want a really nice cover and a hard cover and everything else, it's probably going to be more expensive, sure. But if you're going to keep it light and just keep it on the quick and dirty kind of way, then maybe it's less expensive. I don't know. But I'll definitely look into it, if just to say thank you to the authors for their, here's a big book for you.
Nice.
Yeah,
nice.
It would be nice, wouldn't it? What a coffee table book that would be.
I'll tweet a picture as soon as I have them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm curious, are your families like mine? I mean, my wife and my in-laws, they don't understand the technology that I work in, and they don't pretend to. And my wife would quite often say, if she's struggling to sleep, she would ask me to talk to her about Office 365. So she's never going to read my book. Do you get the same sort of persecution as I do in your lives?
Yeah, unfortunately. My girlfriend it's pretty known with the terms. Like, she knows what is Intune, what is Sentinel, what is MFA. So I get her that far, but like reading the book or even watching this, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the Teams book, the most recent one that I did, my sister-in-law was actually quite excited about it at first, until she realized it wasn't a book from a user's perspective on how to get the most out of Teams. She said, well, that's no good to me. But sorry.
Yep, quite right. Yeah, it's my wife. We shared an office for the longest period of time, and I think she could legitimately wing a conversation with a customer about some of the products now. She just throws out Defender, Endpoint, Intune, on-prem. She knows all the buzzwords, so probably do a better job than me.
Question is, could you do the same with her specialty, Rue?
Absolutely not. I know my lane, and I'm sticking to it.
There you go. But anyhow, we are coming up to an hour and a half mark. I think it's probably about time that we start winding things up. But this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. We've had some good comments in the comments. Thank you for that. Please put some more in there if you want to. But I think it'd be good to close things off by just saying two things. I suppose it's obvious in the title, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. Who should buy this book?
Everyone. Honestly, I think everyone who's interested in security, not just Microsoft products, but people in security wanting to know more about Microsoft as a security vendor, and people coming from the Office 365 side of things, lesser known in the security world and want to know more about security at large. I think there's value for both.
Fantastic. And even more important, final question is, if you want to buy it, where can you get it?
So there's different ways. Well, there's only one platform. We sell through Gumroad, but the easiest way to get to the right pages is to go through the M365 security book website. It's m365securitybook.com. We're going to add it into the comments, make it visible somehow. And from there, you can click on the Get It Now book, and brings you to the Gumroad page where you can purchase it. And the reason why we're doing Gumroad is it allows us to update the files every month. You get a login. There you go. That's the link. That's the direct link to the book. So you can get the updates every month. The m365securitybook.com website is where we publish when we have an update. So that's our mechanism of keeping people informed about, hey, the updates, what's going on with the book. So adding that as a favorite or subscribing to it is very helpful as well. But obviously we push out updates via email too.
Amazing stuff. Fantastic. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything that you'd both like to say to those who are watching? How they can reach you individually and so on and so forth?
Talk to Tess.
Yay! Nicely swerved.
We're on Twitter. We're approachable, so feel free to leave feedback on the feedback at M365securitybook.com. Alias, reach out to us on Twitter, LinkedIn, anywhere, and we'll be more than happy to respond. But Tess first.
Amazing. Well,
we love feedback, so go ahead.
Oh, feedback is great, isn't it? It's the only way to improve and grow. So top stuff. Thoroughly enjoyed having you both on the first ever history-making live edition of Cloud Conversations with Roo and Pete. So this has been an absolute blast. We didn't know how it was going to go, but I think it's gone pretty well. We've had people chatting, we've had people viewing. So thank you all for your time. We love hearing from you. Let us know what you think, and go out and buy this excellent book. We can't recommend it highly enough. Roo, any final words from you?
Nope, just echo your sentiments. Buy the book. The great thing about it is if you're a total dork like me, you can just read it like a normal book, just sit every night and work your way through it. Or if you're more of a normal person, you can just use it as a reference book, right? And if you ever need to jump back to it and refer to something, you can do that just by finding the right chapter. So yeah, totally echo your sentiments.
Amazing. Well,
thank you so much for having us. We had a
blast. You're absolutely welcome. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, and we will talk again for sure. I have no doubt as we go down the road. So, thank you all. Stay safe, and don't forget to like, follow, share, tell everyone about Cloud. What are we called again? Cloud Conversations with Pete and the M365 security book. So we shall bid you farewell for now. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you down the road. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye.